Hello, my name is Lena and my ovaries are as redundant as my wisdom teeth. Take them out of me. I have no use for them. I wish to be unwise and barren. But that doesn't stop people asking me this question. Lena, if there's a climate crisis on, should I be having kids? This is one of the most asked questions when I asked for things that I can cover in videos, and I've avoided it for some years. I think because it's a bit of a sensitive topic, but the most sensitive topics are often the most interesting ones, and the wide spectrum of different kinds of people that are messaging me this question makes me feel like there is a lot to unpack here. Now, as I am child-free by choice and I talk a lot about the climate on the internet, I think people sometimes assume that those two things are conflated. I'm here today to tell you that they are not, and the conclusions that I reach in this video are ones that I think I had in a vague kind of way anyway, but through researching this video and really taking some time to think deeply about how I really feel about this topic made it even clearer to me what my conclusion is. So if you stick around, I'm going to share that with you on the agreement that we remember that I am not an expert, and as somebody who doesn't want children, even if the world wasn't going through a climate crisis, that in your eyes might make me seem either less qualified or more qualified. It kind of takes away the bias, I guess, because I have no personal motivation to find the answer, yes, it's fine. But on a selfish note, I guess my bias could be that I want all of my friends to stay child-free so they can come on wild weekends and never care about having to book childcare ever again. So I guess there are possible biases everywhere, but I tried to come at this as me, the best version of myself, as open-minded as I possibly could be. And I hope that you will share how you feel sensitively and respectfully to each other in the comments below. Now, I think this topic is best understood in two parts. I actually think when people say, oh, should I have kids because there's a climate crisis on, it's actually two concerns masquerading as one. The first concern is what their impact on the planet will be, and the second concern is what the planet's impact on them will be. Are you with me so far? Like the worry that an extra person will drain resources and therefore be bad for the planet versus an extra person will have to experience everything the planet might have in store for them in the next 100 years, and whether that's something we should be putting fictional future people through. Whichever part of the question you're discussing, I think we need to interrogate some inherent assumptions that underlie a lot of the conversations I see online about whether we should have children. And I completely understand why it's confusing. If I did want children, my first thought would be cost of living, cost of childcare, house prices are going up, lack of stability in the job market, AI, and on top of that, a climate crisis. Are you kidding? It is very confusing, but it's also good to remember that usually when you join a discussion, you join it with all of your unconscious information that you've received over your whole lifetime, your invisible biases, your emotive readings of situations, snippets of news articles you might have seen from a distance. So here are some assumptions that I think we do need to interrogate, and we'll try to during this video. More people equals more impact, and therefore less people equals less impact is not true. We'll get into it. The personal decision of whether to have a child is a moral consideration, not just a preference or something that you want or a desire to or to not, but a moral consideration. I'm not sure about that. That it's realistic, possible, and in tune with all of human history that you should assess the safety of the world you are having a child and putting them into before you have one. I mean, if that was a tradition, then we would not have survived this far. And there is a huge question in my head as to whether it's even possible to assess how safe the world will be, or even what kind of world they will be growing up in, especially with the way the world is changing so rapidly at the moment. It's just, I don't think it's possible to really know, and we'll get into that as well. But what it is safe to say is that probably most of your ancestors either didn't ask that question or didn't have the option to ask that question. Whether we should start asking it now is what we're interrogating, but this isn't a normal question. In the whole scheme of human history, it's not a normal question to be able to ask. I think another assumption is that your child's life will be awful if it doesn't have a life that looks like yours. And then finally, the carbon emissions that your future offspring and everyone else that comes after them logically should be applied to you and counted as part of your carbon footprint. I'm putting carbon footprint in inverted commas. We don't have time to get into it right now, but it's a weird concept that I don't know is the most useful one. But we're using it here because that's what people talk about when they ask, should I have kids? They're really asking about their carbon footprint, and they're looking at graphs like this showing where their biggest impact is. And they're looking at that big bar on the right and they're going, shit. So those are the underlying assumptions I want to address in this video. Let's start with that first part of all of those concerns, their impact on the planet. Now, you've probably heard this smug adage, the best thing you can do for the planet is have one less child. And like I said, you've probably seen a graph a little bit like this. Wow, isn't it amazing that the one thing that could have the biggest impact, that could give you the biggest pat on the back, that could save the most carbon, is also the thing of just not doing the thing. How easy, how attractive, how cool. I'll just do that one. Well, one, that's actually a kind of heartbreaking decision for a lot of people. And also, I think there's a bit of a false equivalence here. To start off with, the experts don't agree with these graphs. Oh, I don't know what to tell you. The Guardian did a really big deep dive and asked 363 verified, highly skilled climate experts. And they asked them, through the lens of all of their research, what they thought the most impactful individual actions were. And having fewer children didn't actually make the top 3. If you want to see what they were, they're here. Voting political representatives into power who will actually do things about climate change was almost a unanimous yes. 277 climate experts said that would be a really, really powerful one. Only 42 said that having fewer children would have a really good impact. For me, that isn't as strong as an argument as I think some of these bar charts have made it out to be. And I wanted to delve into why. Well, the study that was cited that makes up a lot of these bar charts was from 2017, and there were lots of headlines about it at the time. It was widely covered because it is a controversial statement, and I know it got a lot of people worrying. It's probably why I got so many emails and messages. Within that study, they interrogate and question how accurate and logical it is to assign emissions this way. The way they got to those big numbers is not just because that baby will be using a lot of nappies or wanting to be driven to dance lessons and swimming lessons and go on foreign holidays. No, that is not how they calculate that big number. It's because all of that human that you have made, like all of their emissions throughout their whole life, half of that is assigned to you in this equation. And not only that, but a quarter of their child's whole life future emissions are also assigned to you. And then an eighth of their child's is it. Do you see what I mean? That part of the bar chart is taking into account all of the future repercussions and all of the future carbon footprints that would be created through that, which is a false equivalence with the other bar charts, because you'd have to say, instead of not driving a car, you'd also have to say, oh, all of my descendants, I swear, will also not drive a car, or I'm going to destroy a fraction of the car industry in the future, which is proportionally representative of how much my offspring would use the car industry. Do you see? It gets very messy if you try and actually equal out the equation so this bar chart would be accurate. On top of that, the numbers that they use to estimate your great-great-grandchildren's emissions are based on historical rates, not possible future rates of fossil fuel usage. And in the future, I think that we're going to be using, yes, fossil fuel, fingers crossed, but even if we're not doing it voluntarily, I don't actually think it will be possible. So we really have no idea, and nobody seems to be able to quantify a realistic number for what your great-great-grandchildren's carbon footprint might be. But whatever it is, it ain't this. So I think it's worth interrogating for yourself whether you agree with the premise that all of your future offspring's carbon offset and every decision that they make in the future should be logically assigned against your final figure. I'm personally not so sure about that. I think the emancipation of a human once you create them is important. They are an individual with their own individual choices, and they're being born into a world that will be radically different from the one that we are sitting in right now. And while you are totally responsible for them up to a certain point and a certain age, don't really think it's fair to like factor in like a massive steak of beef that your great-great-grandchild might eat on their 80th birthday. Do you know what I mean? It's wild. On top of that, I think the reason this data has garnered so much attention and gathered such a frenzy around it is because it's lubricated by a pretty influential history of powerful people deciding that population control of normal people is a much more morally favourable tactic to control things than it would be to, I don't know, ask the rich to share. Shocking, I know. I really encourage you to look into this book called The Population Bomb, which was read and discussed by millions, if not upon billions of people of our parents' generation, and may have influenced how you have heard about the idea of population control while you were growing up. It was written in 1968. The guy who wrote it is an insect expert. He has no qualifications in this topic and did, from what I can tell, very little research. But this became a bestseller book and it is incredibly problematic. If you look into it, it is so incredibly racist and just very poorly written and researched. It predicted worldwide famines due to overpopulation that, just side note, never happened, as well as a lot of other societal upheavals that weren't really based on much research and again didn't happen. And the kind of like borderline involuntary sterilization rhetoric in it influenced a lot of horrific things. So if you want to know more about why we have a really fucked up idea of population control and the personal effects of us absorbing that into our brains and our bodies and our hearts, there are some links below. There's a cool podcast on it if you can't bear to dig too deeply into it. A good overview is all you need, but I need you to understand that these ideas don't exist in a vacuum, and your feeling that you shouldn't have a kid because of the way other people are managing your resources needs some introspection, I think. It's also wild that we're thinking about resources in this way, as if we don't have the opportunity and the feasible power collectively to change those in the present. It's kind of like if the boomers had said that they shouldn't have had my generation because they thought that it might be a housing shortage in the future, even though it was the boomers that caused the housing shortage. So it's worth asking ourselves how actively we are participating in a system that will result in a possible scarcity of resources in the future. And how ironic it is that our immediate reaction is to just be like, well, maybe I read somewhere I shouldn't have children. Maybe I should just do that. To give you an example as to why individual carbon footprints are incredibly changeable, controllable things, and also maybe not the best thing to measure a yes or no question against, are facts like this. If we, reversed most of people having sex and making babies, and we, in the present day, 2024, had the same population on Earth as they did 500 years ago, which is around 500 million. If those 500 million people were composed of the average UK plane passenger, their environmental impact, that small amount of the Earth's population, would be worse than the current, 7.8 billion people on Earth right now. That it would be worse. So the tough truth is that your child's impact isn't from the result of them being a child in the world. It's probably most accurately the result of them being your child, and whatever that entails for the way you live and the way you parent and the country that you're in and the infrastructures that are around you. Not inherently about them being alive or being a child or even just being an extra human on the earth. You only have to look at a graph like this to show that it's not the volume of humans that's actually the problem, it's the way those humans are living and how they are allowed to live given what their governments are doing. It's true that for a lot of people in the West, having one less child would save about 58.6 tons of carbon per year. But if we just reduce the overall national emissions, which aren't just dependent on each individual person, that would save the equivalent of the impact of up to 17 children. Like you'd be minus 17 children if your governments just did better. Do you see what I mean? Another great example that demonstrates this is meat consumption. The number of humans on the planet is rising by about 1.2% every year. But the number of livestock that the planet is having to uphold is rising by about 2.4% a year. Just see what the problem might be. To give you an example of how that would play out if we carry on the way we are, in 2050, the world would be supporting around 120 tons of extra humans, weighing down the earth. But it would also be supporting 400 tons of extra cows and sheep and other farm animals. But it's funnier just to think of the idea of 400 million tons of cows. As it is, raising these animals to eat them is taking up about 75% of the world's agricultural land. We're using a third of our cereal crops to feed them, and by 2050, that number we were talking about a second ago, it could go up to roughly half. So like, we're giving away half of our cereal based food. We're giving away 75% of the land we could be using to grow food for ourselves. Do you see how world hunger doesn't really need to be a thing? It's just that the people that are eating animals that take years and years to grow and have to eat loads of food in that time that could otherwise be used to feed humans. Do you see what the maths is not mathing? It's upsetting, I know, but also hopeful, because you get to customize the answer to this question, should I have children in a climate crisis, when it relates to the impact the child will have. You get to customize that question depending on how you plan to act and how you plan to raise your children. And I'm not saying you should raise your kids to be radical vegans, but what I am saying is that it's worth thinking, as you hopefully do with every other aspect of fictional future parenting, promising yourself you're going to keep reality in mind when you do that. The idea of the normal amount of meat and dairy to feed yourself and your children has changed rapidly over the past 50 years. It's kind of wild. It is by no means normal, even though we do need a clear normal anyway. But if we look at the way most children, percentage-wise, are eating over the world, feeding our kids a huge amount of dairy and meat is incredibly abnormal. Not to mention the fact that it's also kind of against most nutritional science, but we simply don't have time today. If you'd like to learn more about my half-assed approach to veganism and how I'm not trying to shove it down your throat, I promise, but I have been absolutely shattered by the stuff that I have learned about the meat and dairy industry. There's a video up here that you can watch later about that. So let's not get into the reeds with that right now, but I wanted to use meat as just one example of how, when we see these numbers of humans rising in isolation, it doesn't give us a clear picture of what is actually causing the problem. This conversation also makes me think a lot about the film Never Let Me Go, based on a wonderful book, which you should also read, and how it explores this idea of treating human life as a maths equation and how dangerous that can be. That you have to balance the plus and minuses and balance the books to be worthy of living. And I do worry how much that overlaps into ableism, ageism, who is too much of a drain on the system and whether they deserve to live. Like, do you know what I mean? We get very quickly into very, very dank, murky waters. And what I do want everyone to internalize is that it's not your existence that is inherently burning through resources. It is the lifestyle that has been set up for you by the societies that you live in, not inherently you. You are real, unchangeable, and have intrinsic value. Your footprint has been created by some of your choices or the choices of the governments and the societies that you live under. Let's not get those two things twisted. So the second part of this anxiety around having a child during a climate crisis is this idea of the planet's impact on them. What will their lives be like? Implicit question, will their life be worth living in the future? Now, I do think this is just a weird conversation to have in isolation, because I know that for so many people, the apocalypse that we imagine in the future is what they are presently experiencing. The world is ending all the time somewhere for somebody, and I think that this idea that the hell only exists in the future and it can't be seen already is false. Great books on that here, but I also think that a lack of historical awareness, that I always, I can't just live my life remembering that history happened and like remembering what it might have been like in medieval times. Like, I understand those things aren't top of our mind, but I do think lifestyle inflation has made us really inherently forget what it was like when we didn't have an over dependence on the comforts that a lot of us in the West take as normal. And I do think there's a slight pearl clutching at the idea that our kids might not have as much material goods as we did, and whether that would be like a total disaster or maybe just that's fine. Yes, it is possible that the world will be a lot hotter, that there might be less resources. If it's organized well, I think that a lot of people can still have just about enough to have a okay, happy, fulfilling life. If it's organized poorly, well, I'm going to be very angry about that. And I think we all have to try and work together to make sure those kinds of systems don't continue into the future. But it is also worth asking yourself, like, how unluxurious would your life have to be for you to wish that you had never been born? Because there's a big question mark over the future and what your children may or may not have access to. It doesn't make it any less upsetting to not have a child. Like, I'm getting upset talking about it because like almost everybody on the planet, I do have a certain degree of inbuilt empathy. I don't think it's going to be that much less upsetting for you to think about the future if you decide not to have a kid, like, because it's upsetting anyway. And I think that while having a kid, I've heard from some people, it makes it feel a lot more real for them. That's also not a guarantee. There are a lot of people who do have children and are completely intentionally switched off from this kind of thing because they don't want to think about it. So I don't think that having kids actually is a guarantee that it's going to make you feel the future more. But we as a species have always had children knowing that there will be a certain amount of suffering in their life, a certain amount of hardship, and we also have to accept that we have really no idea how much that will be. We don't know what kind of health things they might face in the future. We don't know what's going to happen in our own countries, and yet we have children in the belief that the good will outweigh the bad. So I have to kind of ask, like, why to you might the climate crisis be different to that? Yeah, it might be on a bigger scale, but it's also one of the least predictable things ever, especially in the age that we're in. And I wonder if we all need to start thinking more realistically about over-romanticizing a person's life, teaching people to expect that there will be hard things coming. And I think we all need to think, and I say this as a kind of a cell phone as well, like, this is me talking to me here. I think that we need to learn to sit more comfortably with the powerlessness we have over some aspects of the future. We do have control over what our actions are and what we do to strategically change the future, but we don't actually have ultimate omniscient power over what happens, and that extends as well to the lives of our children. We're not going to have that much power over their lives, what they do, and what the future will hold for them, and making some kind of peace in that, I think, is kind of wise. There's this book that I loved called The Breaks by Julietta Singh, and it talks about this idea of queering the family structure, communal living, living in a racialized body, and through a climate crisis, and as a mother, how she feels about that. It's a really moving, interesting read, and I think if you're thinking about having children, I think it's a really good one. You obviously have, if you're not sure about whether you want children in general, you obviously have to read Motherhood by Sheila Heti first. Like, that's just mandatory reading. But after that, if you think you do want children but you're worried about the climate, this would be my second pick. And there's a really beautiful moment where she has an exchange with her daughter. Wandering the new rooms of the duplex, you peer over my shoulder at my computer screen and ask with interest about the images of the human ice figures. I tell you they are tiny sculptures made by a Brazilian artist. But they just melt away. After she worked so hard to make them, you ask. Yes, love, they just melt away. We study the images one after another, looking at how the sculptures melt at different rates depending on where they are situated in relation to the sun. If we were seeing them in real time, our role would be to witness the melting, to watch them vanish over time, I explain. You say, I would stay for a long, long time, Amma, until everything was gone. And I think that's the idea of, like, is the world so wonderful in some ways that it is worth witnessing and experiencing, even during its destruction, even while parts of it are being really harmed. This idea of not being able to bear seeing anything is really hard to project onto others and be like, oh, you wouldn't be able to bear watching that, so I'm just going to spare the next generation life because I don't think that they'd like it. You know, that's a very, like, almost all-powerful, arrogant position to put yourself and myself in, to make that decision for the next generation of people, that it's not worth it. That the act of witnessing, even if when something is disappearing, isn't inherently a beautiful experience, especially if you are awed by what is disappearing and you respect it. I think there is a huge gap, however you want to categorize life and whatever your beliefs are, between a life that is incredibly hard to live and a life that is not worth living. And I really think it's worth sitting with yourself and working out where that line is for you. For me, it's very far. Life that is hard, very tiny bit at the end of the graph for life not worth living. And I don't even know what will be on the other side of that, really. I also read this book called Notes from an Apocalypse by Mark O'Connell. And in it, he talks about Hannah Ardent's idea of human affairs and how it is very reasonable to expect the unexpected. He talks about this book, The Human Condition. That's by Hannah Ardent, that apparently now I'm going to have to read. But talking about this argument that when it comes to human affairs and how humans behave, because that is really what we're asking ourselves to predict, like, what is human behavior going to be like in the future? We have all the technological and scientific advances to prevent a climate crisis. We just don't know how humans are going to behave in the next 30, 40, 50 years. She says, in human affairs, it is reasonable to expect the unexpected. It's a reasonable assumption to expect something weird from humanity in the next few decades, because we're always freaking doing weird shit. It's always going to get weirder, and that doesn't necessarily mean worse or better. But I think we have to let go of this idea of guarantee when it comes to parenthood. And I think I'd understand people's hesitations a little bit more if they loved the way the world was right now. If they were like, oh my God, if the world could just not change and my kid could be born into this, that would be ideal. But I'm really afraid that the world won't be the way that it is now. Nobody's saying that. The world in so many ways is so badly run, so shoddy, that I think everybody would like their kids to be born into a different world. And what is exciting about what's going on right now is that the world is actually going to have to be reorganized and rebuilt. Like, that is a guarantee. Whether it goes well or not so well is really up to us. We're living in that choice. We're living in that present. And we honestly don't know. The future could be much better for our children than it was for us. Ultimately, when people ask this question, I also hear the question, like, how long have we got? Like, how long? And I honestly, that's an unanswerable question. But from the stuff that I have read, I think that we do probably have another generation. And I think that it would be, if you actively want children, and that is something that is actually going to bring you joy, and it feels like it's your free choice to do, and the only thing that you're being held back from is because of the climate crisis. What I would say is that I think the most humble, wise thing to do is to have children and then let them take the next decision as to whether to carry on the next generation, because they will have a much better idea of how things are going. And it is likely that things aren't going to do this big, like, apocalypse all straight away, like in one day or in 1 hour. That doesn't happen at scale throughout the whole world. And obviously it's worth considering what country you live in, where you're at and where you're living. But in general, I personally think we have at least another generation to work out. And for there not to be very many people around to witness that and to be part of it is a bit sad to me, honestly, I think. So what are the possible fixes for this problem? Because it is a problem. Because if we're all worrying about it, and it's a question that I get asked a lot, obviously there are things that we need to action. Now, some of these are things that we can't action on our own. Some of these things we're going to have to persuade other people to action for us through force or otherwise. But here are some ideas of things that I think are actually better things to discuss rather than sitting around discussing whether we should have children because of the climate crisis. Obviously, we have to overhaul a system that makes it possible for certain companies to emit more than any of the children that I could ever birth out of my body. That's weird. Companies aren't humans. Stop giving them the emissions that otherwise would be owed to real people who would have real experiences. We're also going to have to overhaul our food systems, and that involves making it cheaper and easier for people and parents to eat less meat and dairy. I'm saying less. I'm not saying none. I'm saying less. This shouldn't be down to individual parents. Like, they're not the reason that I can't get a decent vegan lasagna in a freaking Tesco. But what we do need to do is stop subsidizing the meat industry with our tax money and use it towards, I don't know, saving humanity. Another thing I think we need to stop doing is stop moralizing the idea of being a parent or the choice to be a parent. Obviously, how we treat children once they are born is definitely a big moral consideration, but the choice as to whether to do it or to not, I think, is morally neutral. Just like I don't owe anybody a child as a child-free person, you don't owe anybody a childless life. I think it works both ways, and both of those conversations make sense to have together. If you or the person that you are talking to / arguing with is really keen on population reduction, you could give them a lesson in the racialized history of that, but you could also just point out that a really efficient, good, humane, morally great way to reduce the population on Earth would be to make birth control free and accessible and abortion legal everywhere. Because even in the UK, it's not technically legal. We're getting away with it on a little amendment that could be whipped from beneath our feet at any moment. So that those who do want them and do actively choose to have them can have them and choose the size of their family, and those who don't want to aren't forced to. The real population tragedy of our time, I think, isn't the idea that people who really love children and love having them are having too many. It's that there are parts of the population that are growing without the consent of the people's bodies that are being used. And that makes me angry. We should fix that. Before we spend all of our time on national TV discussing the people that have had 4 children and are financially struggling and blaming them for some reason, you could also run the adoption and foster industry in a much more moral way. In loads of countries, it's run really, really poorly, and also make adoption a lot easier for parents to do. From my understanding and the people that I know in my life, it is like incredibly opaque and weird the way that it's run, and it's not helpful. It puts people off before they even start. So if there were parents that were considering adoption, a lot of them have been put off by the way the system is run. So maybe we should fix that. Just an idea. And finally, we don't encourage people with bar charts like this to see the act of not having kids as a quick fix for their climate activism, because we joke about billionaires building bunkers against the world and stuff, and that's something that actually they discuss a little bit in here if you want to hear about some of the terrifying bunkers that billionaires are building. But the personal ethics of prepping, I wonder if that can be projected onto this idea of not having children. Like, are you being a reproductive prepper? Like, you're just dealing with your feelings around how you might feel hurt if your kids suffer, rather than thinking widely about how we can just like prevent that suffering and not require the bunker. Mark O'Connell describes the idea of being a prepper. To be a prepper was to do everything one could do to avoid being one of the sufferers oneself, while contributing nothing to the prevention or the alleviation of the suffering in others. Mark, that hurt. In conclusion, I want to quote a wonderful book called Braiding, Sweetgrass, which I read on my podcast, No Books on a Dead Planet, if you would like to overhear a conversation about it. A good mother grows into a richly entropic old woman, knowing that her work doesn't end until she creates a home where all of life's beings can flourish. And this expansive idea of being a parent or being a mother is really cool to me. The idea that mothers, or the kind of spiritual idea of being a mother, even if you're not literally one, they have a responsibility beyond their own children, beyond their own family. And if the question about whether we have kids or not during this weird climate time is actually really a question about what our responsibility is to ourselves, to our future offspring, and to the present, then let's just talk about that. Let's talk about the idea of responsibility, and your anxieties around responsibility are probably more efficiently placed elsewhere. Population control and the idea of it is an incredibly weird place to jump before we've exhausted all of the other options, to which there are literally hundreds. You can go on Project Drawdown if you don't believe me. Almost none of which the whole world has very thoroughly tried at all. I think it's really sad how easily we're willing to discuss making this huge, seismic, heartbreaking shift of stopping having children, to shrink life where there should be abundance, to enforce huge sacrifices on so many people who haven't participated in this crisis at all. Why are we expecting ourselves to do the unimaginable rather than just imagine a system that could work better? Systems that always change, will change in the future, and can be influenced to change for the better. That seems like a much better use of our time and much more likely. I wanted to conclude this video in a very similar way I concluded my Elijah Told About Marriage video, in that parenthood, like marriage, is an incredible act of optimism. Just like when we cross the street, we have faith that the person that's slowing down to let us go isn't going to then speed up and knock us down. So many of the things we do without thinking are based on trust and implicit hope about the future. Now, that hope is logical if you start acting like it's real and start doing stuff, whatever that means for you. And that hope is delusional if you just carry on living the way that you are now. Either way, hope it is. Honestly, I feel like being a parent in 2024 is kind of punk. It's a radical act at this point, and I would never ask somebody to give up that chance of being a parent if it's something that will bring them joy, if it's something that they feel is a real calling in their life and something that's really important for them to experience, especially when I haven't actually spent enough time asking my MP to pull his freaking finger out. You know what I mean? What do you think about this topic? That's more important than anything that I could ever say. Thank you so much for watching. This video was made possible by the Gumption Club, who tip me per video to make sure these videos keep happening. Here's to positive panic and being optimistically delusional. Frog Snog out.